Welcome back to Focus Today. Well.
Look who's back.
We go from David Capellion to John Mittendorf. I mean, you talk about a loaded show. Here we are. John is a researcher, an apologist. He works with Answers in Genesis. And we've been doing a series with John on biblical leadership for believers, especially during this election cycle. And let me just say this on the outset here. Everything that we have done here with this series is put into, what are we, 24 pages, John?
That's what it is, right? Standing now, yes.
All right, I would recommend not getting this yet.
No, these are done.
Oh, these are done?
Yeah.
Okay, all right, so you can go to hispeoplerejoice@gmail.com. Hispeoplerejoice@gmail.com, and we will send you, John will send you this file of all the notes. And I got to tell you, he's done the homework for you. Now, if you're like me, you like it when somebody else does it for you. And so I would recommend getting these notes. We're talking about biblical leadership. Now, we've talked about pastors and elders, and we've gone through the boards, and we pretty much, and as I told David Capellion, I have picked up, again, I can't remember when the last time I read it, but I've been reading Francis Schaeffer's book done back in the early 80s, the Christian Manifesto. And I'm blown away by how much we have slipped scripturally.
Right. Yeah.
And we see it in bits and pieces in today's culture, but every once in a while you got to stop back, stop and get up to about the 30,000-foot view and look down on, and you can see where things begin to slide. You can point at all kinds of things. When prayer was taken out of school, the Ten Commandments taken out of school, you can see the demise of our culture when the church got infiltrated by the culture in order to win the culture. Well, guess what changed? The church did. The culture didn't. You know?
We just might get into that just a little bit this morning. We start talking about salt and light in the world. And,
so what do we do with leadership? What's the Bible call a Christian leader?
Let's back up just for a second, Perry. You know, the past couple of months, we've been talking about, as you just mentioned, Christian leadership, and we applied it to the church first. Church leadership. Right. Basically, pastors, elders, overseers, and bishops. Right. And the Bible's very specific in Timothy and Titus as far as what that entails. You know, the calling, and then there's 17 characteristics, which is based on the purity of the person, basically speaking. So we covered that. So when you talk about spiritual leadership, now this is my question for this morning's program. Is the Bible also as specific for leadership principles for every believer, not that you're a pastor or an elder, but is the Bible very specific for leadership principles for every believer? And the answer is absolutely yes. I saved you on that one.
I was going to say yes with a caveat. Well, go ahead.
Well, you know, I think it might be a little bit more explicit than sometimes we think. Now, let me back up just for a second. Now, you'll recall a couple of months ago when we started with the leadership principles for the church leadership, I read something that I thought was really kind of a blockbuster, and it was Webster's Dictionary of Leadership. Okay. And it uses the words authority, and I'm quoting, authority, influence, power, force, strength, control, administration.
Okay. Missing the biggest word of all of them.
What's that one?
Humility.
I'm getting to that.
Okay.
That is the secular definition.
Okay. Authority,
influence, power, force, strength, control, administration. So that brings me around to the subject for today's. And by the way, what I want to do is we talked about leadership for the church. Today we'll talk about leadership for the believers. Okay. And then how about next month if we take all that and we dovetail that into politics? Yeah. We have to. Should Christians vote? Are they mandated to vote biblically? And if they're going to vote, what are some of the considerations on voting, which is a big question this year, correct?
Yeah, because I just had David Capellion on knocking in the head the stupid idea of voting between two evils, or the lesser.
The lesser of two evils, yeah. So, but anyway, to get back to what we're talking about, so why don't we do that? The next month we'll take all this and we'll turn it back into the political. Now, what is the Bible's definition of leadership? Because I just gave the secular definition, and I can find that in Matthew 20, 25 through 28, and this is what it says. And there's two key words that I'm looking for in here. Now, in the notes, I've got them highlighted, so you should know exactly what I'm talking about. Okay? But Jesus called them to himself and said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them. Sound familiar?
That's rule.
Yep.
Yep.
And those who are great exercise authority over them. Sound familiar?
Rule.
Yet it shall not be so among you, but whoever desires to become great among you, let him become your servant. And whoever desires to be first among you, let him be your slave, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many.
Wow.
From a biblical definition, what are the two key words in that definition of biblical leadership that is applied to every believer?
Well, I'm going to answer by saying, first, it's the word that's missing in the Webster Dictionary,
okay,
which is humility,
yes, sir,
which is underscored by being a servant and a slave.
Exactly, which at that time was the lowest of responsibilities.
You got to remember, Jesus washed their feet.
Well, we're getting to that. We're getting to that.
Okay.
So, Jesus believes true leadership is based on the primary elements of being a slave and a servant, which is characterized by the phrase servant leadership. Mm-hmm. How does that apply to government today?
Self-leadership.
Self-leadership, yeah.
Not servant leadership.
Yeah, I'm going to use you to further my goals, right?
Yeah, and I think this is something I said earlier. I think we're starving for genuine statesmanship to return.
The spot you played this morning of Netanyahu at the United Nations, when I listened to that, I thought, here is the characteristics of a person who is unafraid, standing alone, believes in his principles, and is willing to get up in front of a world organization, as crooked as they are, and tell it like it is. And if you don't like it, don't let the door get in your way when you walk out of the back of the room.
Yeah.
And and I think a lot of people listen to that and they go, where is that kind of leadership in this country?
Yeah.
Okay? So when we talk about servant leadership, then I think we can say that every Christian, regardless of whether you're in church leadership or not, whether you're an elder, pastor, or whether you're just somebody who's going to church every day and you're a believer, you can characterize that, I think, by saying that every Christian is called to servant leadership, which is based on service to others, and secondly, influence, in other words, change. What is one of our primary charges to us from Christ, which we'll get into here in just a minute, is to make changes in the world, is to direct others to a godly relationship with God, right?
Yep.
So it really is pretty simple when you overview it. So why don't we start off with just two things, servant leadership and then influence. And we'll see if we can get through that before 9 o'clock, okay?
Okay, well, I'll get that. All right, so let's deal with servant leadership.
Okay, let's do servant leadership first. Okay, true leadership begins with the believer whose character and life are primarily accountable to God, number one, okay? And then number two, for motivating people to follow a godly example, as commanded in Matthew. Well, in fact, let me give you one from Philippians. Let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem others better than himself. And you know, you'll find, Perry, when you read the New Testament, you'll find this over and over and over. In fact, let me give you just a couple of examples. And in the notes, I've got multiple examples. But I'll give you one from Mark 10. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom. This one's from 1 Peter. Not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples to the flock. This one is from Luke. Be not so with you. Rather, let the greatest among you become as the youngest, and the leader is one who serves. And there's a lot more. So basically, what's Christ saying?
Serve others.
Serve others, right. Don't put yourself at the top of the pile.
Right.
Put yourself at the bottom of the pile and serve others. Pretty simple, right?
Pretty simple. All right, let me break here because this is a good place to. We're talking about the biblical leadership, and by the way, all these notes, biblical leadership for the church and the believer. This is so powerful, especially as we will tie this all together coming up shortly when John returns on how to apply in the presidential election. But if you want a copy of these notes, it's about 24 pages, very comprehensive. All the homework's done for you. Go to hispeoplerejoice@gmail.com. hispeoplerejoice@gmail.com. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Focus Today. Delight to have in the studio with us John Mittendorf. He's a researcher, an apologist, and we've been doing a series. It's been a very powerful series on the biblical leadership for the church and for believers, and as it applies going into this election cycle. All of these notes, 24 pages worth. John has really done your homework, and he gives this, makes this available for you to have absolutely free. Just go to hispeoplerejoice@gmail.com and request the notes on biblical leadership, and he will send them to you. He'll send that file to you. All right, so one of the key things that we're talking about here is the ability of a spiritual leader to put others before themselves.
So let's summarize that phrase, that servant leadership. And I would summarize it this way, Perry. The ability of a spiritual leader to put others before themselves is significantly different than the phraseology of the modern secular world, which is me first and I want it now. Yep. It's exactly the opposite. Yeah. Exactly the opposite.
Which fits all the other problems we have in our culture.
Yeah.
They're biblically reversed.
Yeah. And so to sort of summarize that, which is, I think, is killer. You know, when I read this, I about fell off the chair. That a clear example of servant leadership is found in John 13:12. And this is the story of Jesus washing his disciples' feet with a towel. And this is what John 13 says. So when he had washed their feet and taken his garments and reclined at the table, again he said to them, "Do you know what I have done for you?" And that phraseology is sometimes summarized by the phrase, "the king who led with a towel." You have to stop and think about that.
What a great title.
Not only is Jesus on his knees washing his disciples' feet, but you got to stop for a second and think, well, wait a minute. This is the creator of the universe. Mm-hmm. This is the person who created everything that we can see, and yet he's on his knees demonstrating to his disciples the king who led with a towel, and and by the way, he's telling them, and I want you to do the same thing.
Well, I have preached a sermon 4 times on John chapter 13 about Jesus washing the disciples' feet, and guess what? He also washed Judas's feet.
Yes, he did, when he knew.
When he knew what
Judas
he would do.
was going to betray him.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
So to summarize that, John 13:15, then he says, "For I have given you an example that you should do as I have done to you." Okay? Mm-hmm. Servant leadership. Now, I mentioned the service leadership basically is comprised of 2 parts. You have servant leadership, and then you also have influence. So the other biblical directive to every believer is that we are supposed to be an influence, 2 areas. The church is supposed to be an influence. Mm-hmm. We're supposed to be an influence in the church to get people within the church to be more like God, a godly influence, and then the secular influence. How is the church supposed to be, or every believer supposed to be, an influence in the world? I have an answer. The Bible.
Salt and light.
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me go back to the church just for a second. Yeah. 1 Corinthians 15:58. Always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. And basically, that's the work of the ministry, to build the body up.
Right.
Would you say that a lot of the church congregations today do that?
Well, you're asking me to be judgmental here.
No. There's room for improvement there, right?
Yes. That's a nice way of putting it.
Okay. Okay. A servant leader constantly desires to invest themselves in the lives of other believers. Then we come to the secular world. And I love this verse, which you're totally familiar with, and I think most people listening have heard this before. This is found in Matthew 5:13-16. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It is then good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. You are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. And basically, you can summarize that entire 4 verses with 1 word: influence.
Yeah, salt and light. And there's a saying that salt penetrates the culture, light exposes it.
Exactly right.
And so how are we doing in that department? When we won't even talk about the culture from the pulpits anymore.
Right. Let me back up just a second and cover salt first. Salt is you just said that a little bit, is both a preservative and a flavor enhancer, but it's commonly believed that Jesus' use of it is a preservative. And when you say it's a preservative, basically what you're talking about is that Christian and the Christian influence in the secular world today should be slated towards retarding moral and spiritual decay and preventing the entire earth from degenerating even faster than it already is. Mm-hmm. Once Christ returns and takes the church out of the current world of what's going to happen, there's basically no Christian influence. Yeah. So yeah, then it's going to go down even further. So then we have light, and of course light. If you hide light, as we just said, salt is unseen in daily activities, but light is obvious as it openly pierces the dark. Yeah. And that's where you have to ask yourself: is the Christian church today and the Christian believer today being an influence in a secular world today?
You asking me that question? I just think it's obvious. It's obvious. We're pointing the fingers everywhere else but ourselves. We're not taking responsibility. And again, I refer to reading this book, and I'm looking down. I realize we're frogs in the pot. We have lost the big view that this thing has slowly slipped. And there's plenty of blame to go around. I'm not looking for fingers to point at, but I do think that we, as believers, have found ourselves at a point asking, has the salt lost its flavor? So are we about to be tossed out?
And has the light been put under a bushel?
And has the light been put under a bush?
Yeah, and I think to a large degree it has.
Yeah. Now, they'll say the culture has attacked us, true, but it's because we abandoned the culture. We didn't change the culture changed us. And I'm thinking, well, and there's a lot of arguments on both sides of that equation, but I think we need to re-examine all this.
Yes, and I think it's just easier as we continue down the road to spiritual decay and worldly decay. It's just easier to become more attuned to everything that's around you, and that's just business as usual. It's not, as an example, in Romans it talks about when you go down the steps, and we've talked about this before, Romans 20, that it talks about the various stages that a country will go through or people will go through until God turns them over. It's called a reprobate mind. Mm-hmm. And I was listening to a speaker the other day that said, okay, he says, what is a good example of a reprobate mind? And he says, a good example today would be, what's the big argument over transgender bathrooms? Mm-hmm. Is there a problem there? Everybody seems to be happy with it. It's not that big a deal anymore. If that would have come up 20 years ago, it would have been a big deal. Not today.
On the other side of this, there is a genuine hunger for righteousness. I've never seen it. I mean, let's just take the response to theDove's programming. We're averaging over 100,000 YouTube downloads a month worldwide. Okay. And when you start to look through the layers of this stuff, I would say that people are looking for two things. They're looking for what is truth, because truth is anything goes these days, and we know that that's wrong.
And by the way, where do you find, what is the sole source today of where you find truth?
Well, it has to be the Scriptures.
Biblical.
Yeah.
Biblical truth.
Yeah. So it's what is truth, and the other one is who can I trust?
Exactly.
So all of a sudden, there's only one category that meets that, and that's biblical truth and Christ.
Right.
Now, we're not electing a pastor, and Jesus isn't on the ballot.
Correct. And nobody is perfect.
And nobody's perfect.
And nobody is perfect, yeah. Yeah, exactly right. Let me finish up with this, just kind of a summary of what we've been talking about.
Sorry, I got off on a tangent. Easy for me to do.
I've got to bring you back every once in a while. I've noticed that.
I have to bring you back every once in a while.
I notice that when I stop talking, you start talking, so I've got to watch that. This is the last part of the notes, and it's what I've titled, Being Called to a Leadership Position. It's what I call application. And this is something that Paul addressed when he asked the question in 2 Corinthians 2:16, who is sufficient in these things? And what I'm saying is what happens when God calls you to do something? Mm-hmm. Generally speaking, your first thought is, Moses. Not me.
Yeah.
I'm not very good at speaking. Yeah. I stutter. Yeah. I have a history of failure. I'm not qualified. But then after Paul asked the question in 2 Corinthians 2:16, who is sufficient? Then he answers the question in 2 Corinthians 3:5. Not that we are sufficient of ourselves, but our sufficiency is from
God.
And in the notes, I go through and I outline God's calling to Moses and Moses' response all the way through up until the final point when God says, okay. And now God's not happy. He says, I'm going to have Aaron be your spokesman when you go before Pharaoh. But what's interesting is that once Moses says, okay, God, I'm ready to go, God used him, put him in the hall of fame for faith in Hebrews, correct?
Right.
And the scriptures also say, let me get it right here, that but since then there has not arisen an Israel and prophet like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. And that's Deuteronomy 34:10. So here's a guy who didn't want anything to do with what God called him to do, whether it's small, whether it's large. And of course, that was a big deal. If you walk before Pharaoh, Pharaoh had the ability to, you're dead.
Yeah.
If the timing was wrong or he didn't like the way your hair was parted or whatever it was. So, I mean, that was a big deal. But at the same time, here's the creator of the universe. I'll be with you and I'll tell you what to say. And Moses is going, no, I'm not a good public speaker. So, and this is the way I would finish up, Perry. What is God calling you to say? Where is God calling you to go? What excuses are you using to defend your lack of faith? And if the Lord created the universe, empowered Moses, as well as other biblical characters, can He empower you and supply the necessary ingredients for success in His calling to you, and whatever that calling is, large or small? And of course the answer is yes, He can.
Well, I would say, in some ways, what I'm hearing you say here, John, is that everybody is a leader.
Everybody is a leader. You don't have to be, you know, when I first started studying for this, I thought, well, you know, wait a minute. Everybody isn't the CEO of a Fortune 500 company. I mean, there's the average housewife, there's the average person who's out mowing their lawn, and yet the Bible directs all of us, every believer, not just church leadership, but every believer to be an influence in this world for Him. That's a command.
Well, folks, I can't say enough for this complete study, and it does apply all the way down. And next time we're together, we'll tie it into the election cycle. But most importantly, this is an incredible biblical research, biblical leadership. And if you'd like a copy of these notes, 24 pages, all done, very comprehensive, go to hispeoplerejoice@gmail.com, request the notes, and John will forward them on to you. hispeoplerejoice@gmail.com. And we'll send those notes on to you. Thanks, man, for your hours and hours of study and research.
You bet. No, it's my pleasure.
I know you love doing it.
It's my pleasure, yes.
Yeah, all right. We'll see you next time on Focus Today.